Welcome back to the afternoon session, after lunch session. Today's session, this session is on medieval gender boundaries. And we have three speakers. The first, Sharon Koren, is an associate professor of medieval Jewish culture at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in New York City. Her book, Forsaken, The Menstruant in Medieval Jewish Mysticism, explores the rationales for the absence of female mystics in Kabbalah. And she is currently working on a book on the matriarchs in the Zohar. Her talk today is on the redemption of Leah in the Zohar.
Okay, excellent. All right, I want to thank the committee for inviting me to the conference. I just wanted to say that essentially my paper is going to be about the lack of women's cultural capital in a land that was formerly under the aegis of Islam. My work is basically on the Zohar in 13th century Spain, and that's what my new book is going to be on, and I'm very honored to be here. This is also my second PowerPoint presentation ever, so okay. Genesis 20, Leah and Rachel are poised as rivals from birth. Genesis 29 to 30 casts Rachel as young, beautiful, and loved, and Leah as older, nearsighted, and hated. Rabbinic Midrash, uncomfortable with the sisters' rivalry, supplements our sparse text with stories to level the playing field. Yet despite their many exegetical efforts, Leah's virtues remain hidden. It is Rachel who becomes the icon of Jewish motherhood, and her name precedes Leah in traditional blessings that include the names of the matriarchs. Also, Leah does not have a boulevard, right, in Jerusalem. Okay, so it is possible to read the biblical narrative against the grain, however. Leah may be older, but as such, she is entitled to an inheritance. Rachel may be externally beautiful, but Leah's beauty is internal. She is fertile. Indeed, Wendy Doniger, in her book, The Bed Trick, compares the Leah and Rachel narrative to two common folkloric motifs. The loathly lady, a beautiful young woman masquerading as an old hag, essentially the female equivalent of the beast in Beauty and the Beast, and the lovely lady, ugliness masquerading as beauty. Doniger explains that in terms of the patterns of folklore, many identify Leah as the lovely lady, that is the older, plainer sister pretending to be the younger, prettier sister to trick Jacob. But Rachel is actually the lovely lady, for her superficial beauty hides that which the Hebrew Bible regards as a flaw far worse than ugliness. And this is a quote from Doniger, Infertility. And by this logic, Leah is the loathly lady because she appears to be ugly, but is in fact beautiful, that is fertile. The mainstream reading, Midrashic reading, however, elevates Rachel over Leah. For example, here the psalmist lauds God for transforming a barren woman into a joyous mother of children. He settles Akeret HaBayit, the barren women in her home, as a joyous mother of children. Many biblical interpreters identify the Akeret HaBayit with the matriarch Rachel. Unlike her elder sister Leah, Rachel was described as Akara in the Bible, and with God's help became the joyous mother of children. Some rabbinic midrashim play on the oral similarity and understand Rachel not as Akara, but rather as the Ikara de Beta, the essence of the house of Israel in this case. In so doing, Genesis Rabbah displaces Leah and makes Rachel the mother of only two of Jacob's 12 sons, the symbolic mother of all of Israel. The Zohar, by contrast, inverts the hierarchy and understands Leah as the true heroine of the story. The Zohar interprets Psalm 113:9 as referring to both sisters. Rachel is, the slide is inverted. Moshivi Akeret HaBayit, refers to Rachel, the first part of the verse, and the second part of the verse, Leah, is the joyous mother of children. So that Rachel is the barren woman in her home, easily seen and appreciated. She is the lower mother. She is the Shekhinah who suffers with her children. And Leah, on the other hand, is the joyous mother of children, the hidden upper mother, the Sfira Binah. With this division, the circle of the Zohar reinterprets the Genesis narrative to create a paradigm of two very different types of mothers that reflect the theological needs of 13th century Jews in Castile. Today, I will focus on Leah, and then next week in the seminar, I will discuss Rachel. So 13th century Kabbalists often divide the 10 Sfirot into two. The first three, Keter Chochma Bina, the more cerebral elements, and the lower 7 Sfirot. This division helps explain an essential aspect of the medieval Kabbalistic myth. Chochma, described as a divine father, implants his seed in Bina, the supernal mother, and then she in turn gives birth to the 7 lower Sfirot. So if you count down, that's 7. Reading Genesis 29 hyperliterally, the Zohar interprets the elder sister Leah as the third Sfira, the upper mother Bina. She is older than her sister Shekhinah, Rachel, because she is an earlier emanation. So she flows through first. Leah as Binah gives birth to 6 sons and 1 daughter, Shekhinah. Her weak eyes and her hated status are marks of her inscrutability to the uninitiated. Younger Rachel, by contrast, is the Shekhinah, the lower mother, and the final Sfira. She functions as a portal to the divine, easily accessible and perceived. Her cosmic function is embedded in the narrative. Rachel Shekhinah first meets Jacob in public because she is the beautiful public face of the Spiritic realm. Their meeting at the well underscores Rachel's cosmic function. The Shekhinah is often symbolized by a well because she collects the emanations of the higher Sfirot and then meets them out to the world below. Jacob, who has not yet achieved his full mystical potential, is able to immediately appreciate Rachel. He works for her for 7 years because she is the 7th and lowest Sfira. His unwitting, blind marriage with Leah was part of a divine plan that he could not yet understand. Jacob simply could not yet perceive Leah as Binah. He thinks her eyes are weak, but it is truly Jacob who cannot see. Leah is not hated. She is rather undervalued, invisible, or misunderstood. And this is one of the quotes from the Zohar that shows this idea. A cluster of mythical images accrue to the sisters that build on the details in the narrative. As I said, Leah is Binah. She's the gates of understanding, the Jubilee, a stork, a Hasidah, the more worthy concealed upper mother. Rachel is the Shekhinah, the sabbatical year. She's revealed, and she is the suffering mother. So first I'd like to just go through some of the symbols with you. And here we have, in the Babylonian Talmud, Rosh Hashanah states that 50 gates of wisdom, that is of Binah, were created in this world, all of which were given to Moshe, save one. As it is written, you made him little less than God. Kabbalists interpret the Talmud's words literally and understand the Sfira of Binah as containing 49 of those 50 gates of wisdom. To this association between Binah and 49, Kabbalists further connect the symbol of the Jubilee. Leviticus puts limits on the use of land, fruit, and other possessions every 7 years, the sabbatical year. The Jubilee celebrates the 49th year, the 7th of the 7-year cycle. Thus, by the Zohar's associative property of symbols and very interesting arithmetic, Rachel, Shekhinah, is the seventh Sfira, is sabbatical year, whereas Leah, Binah, is the Jubilee, acquired after 7 years of work and 7 days of Sheva Brachot, 7 times 7. As Jubilee, Leah has more prestige than Rachel. And here we see, so Rachel gave birth to 2 sons, and Leah to 6 sons and a daughter. Therefore, those first years were concealed, and Jacob did not perceive them because they belonged to Jubilee, while those belonging to sabbatical were revealed. For sabbatical revealed, he served Jubilee, concealed, as it is written. And from here we learn that through revealed, through Shechina, one can reach concealed. Revealed Rachel is the way that one can approach Binah, Leah. The locations of each sister's burial reaffirms the association between revealed Leah and revealed Rachel and concealed Leah. Rachel, revealed, is buried on the side of the road, visible to all passers-by. Leah, by contrast, is buried in the cave of Machpelah, concealed from most eyes. Her burial next to Jacob is the mark that she was the more worthy sibling. Perhaps my favorite symbol for worthy Leah is a stork, a notion derived from Psalm 104:17, but also a very common bird in the area the Zohar was composed, Castile Leon, as noted by Elisheva. The Hebrew for stork is chasidah, a term that also means kindness and piety. And rabbinic midrash and medieval commentators understand the bird's name as a mark of her pious behavior. In the Zohar, by contrast, Leah is a chasidah because she gives birth to chesed. So here is Binah, and then from Binah, she gives birth to chesed, and that's why she's a chasidah. So, chesed, according to, what did I do? Chesed, here we go. Chesed, loving kindness, issues from her. She's the source of all goodness and radiance. Why does the Zohar go against the traditional reading of the biblical text to elevate Leah? The Zohar's reading of Leah must be understood within the context of Jewish life in Castile in the 13th century. The circle of the Zohar was active during the cultural renaissance inspired by Alfonso the Wise of Castile, 1221 to 1284. Yet his reign was far from a golden age for Castilian Jewry. The situation of Castilian Jewry took a turn from the worst, particularly beginning in the last quarter of the 13th century, coinciding with the composition of the Zohar. Though Alfonso the Wise did employ Jewish courtiers and involve Jewish scholars in his translation efforts, his legal works and economic policies ultimately had a negative impact on Jewish-Christian relations in Castile. He included anti-Jewish legislation drawn from Roman and canon law into his Fuero Real and his Siete Partidas. Moreover, in an attempt to stay the economic crisis that plagued his reign, particularly in his later years, colonizing Andalusia and financing a cultural renaissance is not inexpensive, he increased taxes on Jewish communities and increased the crown's cut in Jewish business practices. Desperate for funds in 1279, he had many of the leaders of the Jewish community held hostage for an enormous ransom. And in 1280, Alfonso publicly executed a Jewish tax farmer who had channeled funds to Alfonso's rebellious son, Sancho, along with other Jewish tax collectors who were innocent. Though Todros Halevi Abulafia, the leader of the Jewish community of Toledo, and according to Yehuda Libes, the prototype for Shimon Bar Yochai of the Zohar, managed to escape this fate, the circle of the Zohar must have realized that Jewish fortunes could change in an instant. Both Jews and Christians understood the relative powerlessness of their relative powerlessness in terms of a typology of Rachel and Leah. Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, Manasseh and Ephraim, Rachel and Leah become typologies for greater conflicts between Jews and Christians. In Rabbinic Judaism, Jacob is most commonly interpreted as the Jews and Esau as Edom, as you know, and with the Christianization of the Roman Empire, then Christianity. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, understands that Jacob is the church and Esau the Jews, and one day the elder, that is, the hated, blind, obstinate Israelites will serve the younger, beloved Christians. Church fathers as early as Justin Martyr in the 2nd century similar interpret the weak-eyed Leah as the synagogue and the younger, loved, beautiful, and shapely Rachel as the church. The younger, loved, and faithful siblings defeat the older, rejected, impious ones. The earliest pair of visual representations of Rachel and Leah as ecclesia and synagoga, personified as women, begin to appear in Carolingian ivory. The earliest representations of ecclesia and synagoga, personified as women, begin to appear in Carolingian ivory book covers and crucifixes in the 9th century. In the 12th century, sculptors began to embed the ecclesia and synagoga motifs within the structural program of church tympana. With the rise of Gothic art in the 13th century, the established images of ecclesia and synagoga take up prominent positions in medieval monumental sculpture, most famously in Strasbourg, Reims, and Bamberg. Nina Rao explains that, and I quote, "Artists enlisted the now well-developed ecclesia and synagoga motif and used it to project an ideal of Jewish subjugation within an ideally ordered Christian world. Their appearance on the exterior of churches demanded the attention of passers-by, including Jews." Pairs of ecclesia and synagoga are rare in Spain. Some scholars have even argued that the image would not have been known to Iberian Jews. However, though unnoticed by many scholars, modern scholars, likely because they are badly damaged, a monumental pair of ecclesia and synagoga flank the northern portal of the western facade of Leon Cathedral. After his father sponsored the construction of the first Gothic cathedral, the Cathedral of Burgos, in 1221, Alfonso the Wise sponsored the Cathedral of Leon in 1255. The construction of Leon coincided with the composition of many of the Zohar's teachings, and it was completed in 1302, approximately 3 years before the death of Moshe de Leon. The building of a Gothic cathedral could not go unnoticed. The circle of scholars that created the Zohar all lived within reach of Leon. Though he died in Avila, Moshe de Leon's name derives from that city. Yosef Chikatilla hailed from Segovia, Moses of Burgos, clearly from Burgos, Todros Halevi Abulafia from Toledo via Burgos. Leon and Burgos both lie on the pilgrimage road to Santiago de Compostela, and Jews, along with Christian travelers and pilgrims, traded and traveled frequently in the cities along this road. They would have been aware of the cathedral's construction and almost certainly would have seen the west facade, the main entrance of the cathedral that abuts the town square. Moreover, in Leon, ecclesia and synagoga were especially prominent, as you can see here. An open porch was constructed before the 3 main portals that were used to provide shelter, to conduct business, and to serve as the appeals court. And this is where the appeals court was, right in the center. On the 4th statues are attached to each of the 4 piers that support the exterior porch. On the northwest portal, ecclesia and synagoga jut out to face the crowd. Synagoga's face is downcast, thank you, and her eyes are covered by a serpent rather than the more common blindfold. This unusually sinister representation is also found in King Sancho VII of Navarre's illustrated Bibles dated to 1197. Though the examples of Leon are well worn today, in the middle of the 13th century they would have been prominent, newly carved, brightly painted sculptures that protruded from the most attention-getting edifice in town. To imagine it, it's helpful to see this similar polychrome synagoga, also from Castile, published by Pamela Patton. Its interior location has better preserved it for us to see. Kabbalists would have seen these central figures, and they would have responded to the challenge of Christian supersessionism in their exegesis. Kabbalists subverted the symbol of blind synagoga and made her the image of the upper mother in heaven. She is all-powerful, and, like Leah, cannot be seen by any but the most elect. Jews are not blind, rather it is only the maskilim that can truly see. As such, the Kabbalists of the Zohar take an anti-Jewish Christian motif and make it an emblem of Jewish power. In so doing, Leah was finally redeemed. Thank you.
Well,
Oh my gosh.
that was a stunning reversal. Her is Rebecca Weiner, Associate Professor of History at Villanova University. Her work focuses on recovering the experiences of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim women using Latin notarial records from archives in Catalonia and Roussillon. Professor Weiner has published many articles on medieval wet nursing and motherhood, and her talk today is called Breastmilk and Community, Gender Boundaries and Wet Nursing Practices Among Muslims in al-Andalus and Jews, Christians, and Conversos in Medieval Spain.
Can you all hear me? Yeah? Excellent. Thank you. So, and does everyone have a copy of the handout, or is it coming around? Excellent. Great. Thank you so much. So, as you were looking over the titles for the presentations today, I would not be surprised if you glanced at mine and wondered how I would cover such a broad topic in only 20 minutes. Indeed, starting in Muslim-ruled Spain or al-Andalus around 800 of the Common Era, and ending in Christian Spain without Jews or Muslims almost 800 years later, I can only indicate some watersheds and trends. That said, viewing Jewish, Muslim, and Christian relations over time through the lens of breast milk and wet nursing can help us understand continuity and change in the policing of community boundaries through women, and the nature of cultural prejudice as articulated through ideas about women, lactation, and reproduction. This is the landscape against which Jewish women lived and generated cultural capital, and thus I hope my remarks will spark future and further discussion. Throughout this period, religious, legal, and scientific norms shaped wet nursing practices, as did the biological needs of growing infants and toddlers and the child care desiderata of their parents. Many elite parents chose wet nursing over mother's milk, hoping to allow wives to become pregnant more frequently and increase their family size. The quotidian provision of infant nourishment was tricky in an era when breast milk substitutes like animal milk or coddles were dangerous, and following the medical theories of the late antique thinker Serenus, a lactating woman was understood to only have enough milk to nourish a single child. Wet nursing thus transferred a woman's life-sustaining breast milk from one infant to another. The wet nurse's infant was displaced to a less desirable caregiving and nourishment situation, sometimes even abandoned. This work was well remunerated, especially when the wet nurse came to live in the home of her charge and in high demand. Indeed, the high salary and requirement that the wet nurse halt her own reproduction tempt me to compare high-end wet nursing to the institution of surrogate motherhood today. However, studying biologically related aspects of women's lives, such as breastfeeding, forces historians of women and gender to address continuities in women's experiences while recognizing historically contingent realities. My work on wet nursing has revealed an enduring economy of women in which their milk and nurturing care verged on the fungible, but some wet nurses had more control over the situation than others. There was significant change over time. Furthermore, whom elites hired or put to wet nursing work, which exacted such a cost on the children, families, and reproductive potential of the wet nurse, altered among those of different faiths in different times and places, as well as within the social hierarchy of wet nursing. One overall continuity is the concern of religious leaders, natural philosophers, and medical writers with the effect of breast milk on the development of the child. Infants were so weak at birth, it seemed logical to medieval writers that they continued the development started in utero after they came into the world. To them, both gestation and lactation developed the baby's body and mind. Breast milk was perceived by Jews, Muslims, and Christians to be generated from the lactating woman's blood, as discussed in Babylonian Talmud Nida 9:8, cited by Elisheva Baumgarten. Ibn Zakaria al-Razi, who died in 923, and Ibn Sina, among many other Muslim medical writers, and the Franciscan encyclopedist Bartholomeus Anglicus, active in the University of Paris during the mid to late 13th century, described a blood vessel linking the uterus to the breasts that delivered the blood transformed along the way to the white liquid of milk through the heat of the mother's body. Concerns about women becoming pregnant while nursing were expressed by Serenus, Muslim medical experts in Babylonian Talmud Yevamot 12b, and by Christian natural philosophers. Authorities from all three faiths also wondered which aspects of a nursling's health and character were derived from their mothers and which from their wet nurses. They discussed the desirable qualities of a good wet nurse and the potential dangers of a bad one. Having panned over the shared concerns about breastfeeding of Jews, Muslims, and Christians, I want to focus in on wet nursing in Iberia, starting when Spain was in Muslim hands, or most of it, and was known as al-Andalus, a prosperous frontier region of the Islamic world. In his pioneering study, Infants, Parents, and Wet Nurses, Medieval Islamic Views on Breastfeeding and Their Social Implications, Avner Giladi lays out the Islamic ethical position over the longue durée with analysis of Quran, commentary, hadith, medical literature through to the 16th century. Muhammad himself was nourished by a wet nurse, and in Islam, uniquely for the monotheist religions, breastfeeding created bonds of kinship. As Muhammad Hossein ben Khera further explains, milk kinship is constructed in exact symmetry to consanguineous kinship. The milk father engendered the wet nurse's milk with her pregnancy, an analogy between childbirth and breastfeeding. As its political and cultural height, the Umayyad Emirate, and after 929, the Caliphate of Cordoba, intermarriage between Muslim men and Christian and Jewish women was commonplace in al-Andalus, and religiously mixed families were a regular result. For example, as emerges from reading the sources on the voluntary martyrs of Cordoba. In her 2013 monograph, Defining Boundaries in al-Andalus, Muslims, Christians, and Jews in Islamic Iberia, Janina Safran analyzes the questions that Muslim members of religiously mixed families addressed to their legal experts, and the answers the fuqaha provided between around 800 and 1200. The overarching concern was how a Muslim could live a good religious life while respecting Christian and Jewish relatives. And obviously, we've just heard from Uriel about this, and hopefully we can talk about it more later. The issue of wet nursing across religious boundaries appears alongside that of intermarriage. The Maliki Sunni legal school, which pertained in al-Andalus, in some of the jurists discouraged interfaith marriage, but they never forbid it. And the scholars of al-Andalus also worried that a Jewish or Christian mother or wet nurse might raise Muslim students with her Muslim children with her customs, eating her food, that these might have been forbidden foods. In her work on medieval Ashkenaz, Elisheva Baumgarten analyzes a suggestive parallel in the area of wet nursing, although not intermarriage. She has shown that Rabbi Isaac ben Moses, author of the Sefer Or Zarua, who died around 1270, warned that the milk of a non-Jewish wet nurse who ate unkosher food could have a deleterious moral effect on a Jewish nursling. And Menachem HaMeiri of 13th century Perpignan stated that for similar reasons, it was the way of the pious to choose a Jewish wet nurse instead. However, Baumgarten stressed that this worry did not shape the behavior of most Jews in Ashkenaz, who regularly used Christian wet nurses and fed Jewish children whatever they thought was best for their health. It is likely that in al-Andalus, too, the moralists were largely ignored. Furthermore, unlike Jewish authorities, Malik did not object to a Muslim woman breastfeeding Jewish or Christian children, as long as that Muslim wet nurse did not reside in a non-Muslim home. Moreover, despite the fact that following Avodah Zarah, Jewish women were not to serve as wet nurses for non-Jews, Giladi found that medieval Muslims regularly employed Jewish and Christian wet nurses. Safran even wonders if non-Muslim wet nurses were better accepted in al-Andalus than elsewhere in the Islamic world, regardless of Maliki moral exhortations, because intermarriage was so frequent. As they conquered more and more land previously under Muslim rule, Christian kings, nobles, and urban elites enacted increasingly restricted laws regulating relations across religious lines, including wet nursing. By the 13th century, the Castilian Cortes banned wet nursing across any confessional lines, instead of just blocking Christian women from nursing Jewish or Muslim children, as later 12th century ecclesiastical legislation had mandated. In the Crown of Aragon, the focus of my research, the ban on Christian wet nursing for Jews and Muslims was ratified at a council in Tarragona in 1239, and then by the next generation passed into municipal legislation in Tortosa, Valencia, Perpignan, among others. So if you take a quick look at this handout, the first thing is a map, because I am not assuming that the majority of people in this room know what the Crown of Aragon is, right? Let alone where any of these towns are. So I wrote a book on Perpignan, so it's big on this map, but you can see, yeah, right? So you can see Perpignan, or Perpignan in modern French. You can see Girona or Girona in Catalan, Barcelona, Valencia, the Balearics. And this is Aragon and this is Catalonia. You can see this was linked. The reason these are in different colors is because at one point there was a break in the kingdoms. A younger son got away for a while, but this was all the same cultural area. They all spoke Catalan. And then I'm going to mention Castelló de Empúries as well, so there's a little map of that there. Thank you. So this legislation that I just mentioned, and the work of Catalan moralists like Raymond Lull, who underlined the importance of wet nurses in forming the characters of children they breastfed, led me to analyze 300 transactions concerning wet nursing practice from around 1250 to 1400, and to ask who actually did this work. My most recent article, The Enslaved Wet Nurse's Nanny, the transition from labor in childcare in Barcelona after the Black Death of 1348, was just published in the Journal of Slavery and Abolition. And there I show that from 1290s to 1348 in Barcelona, no Jews or Muslims appear serving as wet nurses for Christian families, and neophyte slaves are very rare. Instead, elite Christians usually employed free married matrons as wet nurses, and the work of these wet nurses was very well paid, but took place over one or more commonly several years in the homes of their employers, away from the wet nurses' own children and families. A few decades after the Black Death, there was a 20-year period when freeborn wet nurses were able to negotiate favorable terms of service for themselves, their children, and their families. But by 1400, that trend was reversed. There are twice as many references to enslaved wet nurses as there were for free women engaging in the trade. And although wet nursing remained well paid, the favorable situations of freeborn Christian wet nurses and their families that had existed in the 1360s and 70s were no longer possible in 1399. Wet nurses no longer regularly took their own children into service with them, gaining the valuable right to feed them out of the household stores. And the enslaved wet nurse, with little or no ability to champion the needs of her own infant, became a more desirable child care provider. The purchase of a newly baptized enslaved woman to wet nurse was a financially shrewd one after 1360, and cost was always an issue. However, over the course of the 14th century, the decisions of elite masters to employ enslaved instead of free wet nurses had just as much to do with their terms of service. Getting the free wives and mothers to remain as wet nurses for multiple years that infants and toddlers required was challenging, even for the wealthy and powerful, since these women needed to return to their own families. Enslaved wet nurses could never leave. An enslaved woman was not the ideal wet nurse the Christian moralists of the 1300s envisaged. She was, however, a person who could not negotiate her conditions of service. Wet nursing contracts survive for Jews, too, in the archives of 14th century cities in the Crown of Aragon, and they also relate exclusively to freeborn Jewish wet nurses. There are no surviving transactions in which Jews purchase unbaptized lactating women or hire Christians. This doesn't mean that Jews had no Muslim slaves as wet nurses and never hired Christians. Around the late 13th, early 14th century, Rabbi Solomon ibn Adret of Barcelona allowed Jewish mothers to hire non-Jewish wet nurses. In the Crown of Aragon, Jews hiring non-Jewish wet nurses got more difficult over time, however, and their ownership of domestic slaves overall declined. By the second half of the 14th century, some ecclesiastical authorities were actively on the lookout for Christian women who served as wet nurses in Jewish homes. When the Bishop of Vic, for example, visited Santa Coloma de Queralt on the 13th of June, 1331, he noted he was making inquiries into an accusation that Christian women had been breastfeeding Jewish children, presumably so he could identify these women and excommunicate them. I have collected 25 Latin and Catalan contracts concerning Jewish employers and wet nurses, 4 from the towns of Castelló de Empúries and Girona from 1300 to 1340, 16 from Barcelona, between 1369 and 1389, and 5 from Perpignan in the late 1300s to 1413. I've transcribed the employment contract of Simfa, wife of David of Castelló de Empúries, from the 5th of March, 1301 for you today. It's the second item on the handout. And so if you just read it, you get a sense of the contract. There's a lot of formulae in it, but if you have any questions about any of them later, I'd be really happy to answer them. So Simfa, Jew, and I've given you my English translation and the Latin. Wife of David, Jew, residing in Castelló de Empúries, with the goodwill and consent of the said my husband, I send and convey myself to you, Jafia Ravaya, Jew of Castelló de Empúries, henceforth for 1 year continually as a wet nurse, namely to watch over, breastfeed, and care for well and legally to the best of my ability, your son Mayaro, and will not leave, etc., and if I flee, etc., and I'll be faithful, etc., in everything, and I swear by the 10 Commandments, etc., and I renounce all rights, etc. So, for example, rights in Roman law. You are truly bound to provide decently in food and drink for me and my daughter Sita, and also above this to give me 5 Malgorian sous each month and 2 shifts and the shoes that I need. Okay, so this important concession is pretty crucial, and this Jewish wet nurse really gained something tangible from her employer with that grant to her child. Jafia Revaya was rarely, this kind of concession was rarely available to Christian wet nurses at that time, and the ability for Simfa to bring her daughter Sita with her when she entered the home of her employer Jafia Revaya and to feed her little girl well from the household larder was an important one. Again, in Barcelona, this concession is only made to Christian wet nurses in the 1360s and 70s when labor was most dear and domestic slavery was not yet widespread, and employers needed to attract free-born women to this work. Christian employers resented allowing mothers to bring their children into service as distracting wet nurses from their charges and affording them the access and opportunity to breastfeed their own infants or toddlers, which was forbidden. Moving forward chronologically to the decade of 1391-2 massacres of Jews throughout Iberia, we can turn to the issue of wet nurses who converted to Christianity from Judaism, also known as Conversos. 2 Conversos appear in the Barcelona record, both near the bottom of the social hierarchy of individuals involved in the wet nursing trade. At this time, Conversos did not tend to be in financially privileged positions. For example, no documents are extant in which a Converso or Conversa purchases or rents a slave to serve as a wet nurse, the most common type of wet nursing contract from Barcelona in the 1390s. On the 12th of May, 1394, the first Conversa, Jacques Meta, wife of the Converso Joan Elias, acting with her husband, acquired the enslaved baby girl Eulalia. They were hazarding attempt to keep the infant alive, to sell later, or to keep as a domestic servant. Enslaved infants were often sold away from their mothers 2 weeks to 4 months after birth, so that the mother's milk supply was established before she was set to work as a wet nurse, and her attention was not diverted from her new charge. On the 4th of March, 1400, the second Conversa, Isabel, wife of the Converso Bernat Esquert, a tailor, agreed to a 2-year separation from her baby and husband when she became the wet nurse of Clara, the daughter of Joan de Michavilla. This Conversa was probably impressed as she entered her employer's large and stately residence. Michavilla is described as venerable, and one of the witnesses to their transaction was his squire. Isabel and Bernat Esquert probably not only needed the money from the transaction, they needed the connections with this powerful old Christian family. Before Isabel reported to work, Bernat sent their 7-month-old son, Jaume, to the home of a much cheaper wet nurse for the next 6 months, and this baby would be weaned early at the age of 13 months. Demand for young, healthy wet nurses exceeded supply, and elite masters put whomever it was legal to do so to serve, leaning toward the cheapest option and the longest amount of time of service, at least 2 years. Isabella's Conversa background does not seem to have posed too much of a concern to her employers. But if we move to the last stop of the later, when we move into the 1500s, during the course of the 15th century, wet nursing in Iberia changed yet again. It had been illegal for unbaptized Jews and Muslims to serve as wet nurses for Christian children, and now Christian moralists also frowned on the prospect of Christian descendants of Jews and Muslims breastfeeding the children of old Christians. So this was throughout the 14th century. First, we had rioting in Toledo, and we had the first purity of blood statutes. Then we had the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition, and then even a backlash in 1485 after that, when at the Royal Monastery in Guadalupe, there was an affair where many Conversos were found to be Judaizing, and a blood libel in 1490 against a Converso, not a Jew. So this, once we get to the 1500s, we have purity of blood being a common concern. The Spanish Inquisition would target different groups in different times, and as René Levin Melammed has, among others, has shown, between the 1480s and 1570s, Conversos were the focus. While a generation later, Moriscos, that is, Christians of Muslim descent, would attract the most attention. Petitions to prove purity of blood became ubiquitous by the late 1500s, and to quote David Nuremberg, "No one was entirely above suspicion. After all, it didn't take much Jewish blood to convey a predilection for these immoral practices. A distant and forgotten ancestor would suffice, or perhaps just a wet nurse descended from converts, since breast milk was derived from blood." And in 1589, university-trained encyclopedist Franciscan Juan de Pineda could urge the passing of legislation against conversas and moriscas serving as wet nurses for old Christian children. So take a look at my last thing on the handout for Juan de Pineda. This is a dialogue that he wrote. It's called "On the Education of Children Among Their Equals, the Importance of Breastfeeding and for Inculcating Habits." So the first person in the dialogue, Philotimo, says, "A thing that's very fitting is to be provided by those who govern the state, in other words, the kingdoms of Spain, is that neither a Morisca nor the one of the blood of Jews wet nurse a son of old Christians, because the blood still knows the sticking of the beliefs of their ancestors, and without its fault can gather up a certain vice or aftertaste through which afterwards men might think badly. And many times I have heard said of a man of a good brain in conversation that was 1/8 of Jewish descent, that his blood never ceased to pester him to become a Jew." In the second part of the quote, he refers to the way Moriscos don't really know how to talk as a parallel situation. So as the service, though, as the Converso wet nurse in Barcelona in 1400 implies, it would take pervasive legislation to enforce these kind of ideas. And as Pineda's own focus on spoken language implies, masters and mistresses faced between the choice of a newly baptized slave from a faraway land who barely spoke Spanish, or a conversa, when even in the Spanish Golden Age, when virtues of language are being trumpeted, that would have been a difficult call. I think they would have picked the conversa. In conclusion, we've finished our grand tour from 800 to 1600, and what have we learned? Even though it only engendered kinship in Islam, for Jews, Muslims, and Christians, wet nursing was akin to marriage and sexual relations and the taboos it might conjure. Yet, despite the fulminations of moralists of all faiths throughout the period, the demand of employers for wet nurses who would care for their charges for an extended period of time at what employers deemed a decent rate shaped wet nursing practices more than ethical norms. Moral injunctions were best effective when enshrined in laws that were enforced by ecclesiastical, royal, and municipal officials, and even then, some probably tried to find ways around them. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Someone asked before about
sexual economics. This is another form of bodily sale and economics.
Thank you.
That isn't strictly sexual. Our third speaker is Uri Melammed. Dr. Uri Melammed works on the Historical Dictionary of the Hebrew Language Project at the Academy of Hebrew Language. He has published articles relating to medieval Jewish and Judeo-Arab documents and teaches courses on the Yemenite tradition. In this case, he has an amanuensis. That is, Renee is going to read some of the English, and so it will be a sort of joint presentation.
Is that okay now? Okay. The Karaite community granted total equality for its boys and girls concerning the commandments of Judaism. The various writings of the scholars in this congregation have not devoted a special section or chapter to the status of women according to their beliefs. They do not even refer to women's religious obligation. This approach becomes apparent when considering some of the differences between the customs of the Karaites and the Rabbinites. The following 6 examples will clarify this claim. The Karaites do not recite the blessing, Baruch atah shelo asani isha, blessed art thou who has not made me a woman, but Baruch atah habori b'tselem enosh, blessed art thou who created me in human form. 2. Women are not exempt from the time-bound commandments, mitzvot zman geraman. 3. Testimony of a woman is completely equivalent to testimony of a man. 4. The Karaites do not prevent women from holding positions of leadership. 5. Rights and obligations of husband and wife are identical at the time of divorce. 6. Women are recognized members of the Karaite prayer group. There is a very thin screen separating the men and the women in synagogue because of concern for impurity due to the women's monthly cycle. Following this general introduction to Karaites and the status of women, one needs to discuss the importance of the term precise reading of the Torah, or the laws for reading Bible. We find this term used by the ancient Karaite biblical Hebrew grammarian of the 10th century, namely Harun Abul Faraj Harun, and others who were extremely precise regarding the laws for reading Torah. These were aptly analyzed by Ilan Eldar in 1994, who coined the technical term used pertaining to the precise reading of the Torah in his book, The Art of Correct Reading of the Bible, Torah Takriya Bamikra. Acquiring such expertise in the art of reading Torah was granted a special status among the Karaites. Proper reading includes preserving the tropes accurately and properly producing the tones of the melodies while making sure to achieve the most precise pronunciation, reflecting the texture of the letters and retaining the musical measures of the holy text. In his aforementioned book, Eldar discusses the rules for proper reading of the Bible as though it is an independent literary genre. He ascertains that as a result of the influence of Arabic linguistics, the authors of monographs such as Hidayat al-Qari, the medieval treatise Guidance of the Reader, essentially created this independent literary genre by means of their detailed and precise description of the art of reading Bible. There is no doubt in our mind that Eldar's assessment is correct regarding the influence of the status of precise reading of the Koran in Islam without compromising. Similarly, he understood its significant contribution to the Mesorah masters, Ba'alei HaMesorah, who provided the notations regarding the exact traditional text of the Bible, and the linguistic scholars in the Orient and in the West in terms of their meticulous attitude towards reading the Bible and preserving all its traditions. A look at how the Quran is read should prove edifying. The act of reciting the Quran in Arabic or elocution is known as Tajweed al-Quran. There are rules for correct traditional pronunciation and intonation. The reader, al-Qara, must be thoroughly familiar with all of the rules, be they major or minor, of reading the Quran before he can read publicly in a mosque or via mass communication or in any of the various social and community contexts due to the sacredness of the Quranic text. Concerning women readers, Muslim adjudicators in the Arab world forbid Muslim women from chanting or reading the Quran without the presence of male family members. Essentially, this forbids them from appearing in public in order to chant or recite from the Quran in front of an audience. This prohibition is still adhered to in Iran and Turkey today and was strictly observed until 4 or 5 years ago when the harbinger of change for women reading the Quran in public appeared in the media. The learned American Muslim Al-Ustadha Tahira Ahmad opened the first plenary session of the 50th Islamic Society of North America's convention on August 30th, 2013, with the recitation of the Holy Quran. This was the first time that a woman had been invited to recite the Quran in public. This event led to positive and supportive responses as well as to negative dissenting reactions in the Islamic world. This precedent caused numerous Muslim women to join the current movement of female readers who receive guidance from Muslim religious individuals who support this innovation, which derives from the requested equality. A Muslim woman who reads the Quran is entitled Al-Qara'a. Al-Qara'a. Please take a look at, see if you get the YouTube, Ori? At this YouTube excerpt, which recorded Tahira Ahmad as she read, you need it from here? As she read Surat al-Hashr 59, the portion about the banishment, the verses 18 to 24. Technical difficulty. I see her, you don't.
Well, you can hear. Escape? Sit here, sit here.
Okay, all right, okay. We hear her. There's nothing like a 21st century technical difficulty. Okay. Essentially, according to Rabbinic Judaism, a woman or a minor who knows to whom one is blessing is allowed to go up to the Torah. Oh, and she's singing in background music for me. Oded. But the sages agreed that a woman should not read Torah out of respect for the congregation. Isha lo tikra b'Torah mipnei kvod hatzibur. There are also prohibitions preventing a minor from being called up to the Torah who is not yet of age. Today, women receive aliyot in Reform and Conservative synagogues, and some modern Orthodox congregations organize egalitarian prayer groups or women's groups. In the Karaite synagogues, women are not prevented from talking or from singing, for the Karaites do not accept the rabbinite principle that a woman's voice is sexual incitement, kol ba'isha erva. In the Karaite synagogues, there are separate spaces in which the men and women pray. However, this separation is due to modesty, since the Karaites prostrate themselves during the prayers. When a woman engages in this action, she might inadvertently expose herself. At the same time, the laws of purity weigh heavily on the Karaite women. During the 7 days of impurity, they must refrain from certain types of social contact and must eat at separate tables. In their synagogues in Israel, Karaite women are not called up to the Torah. Despite the fact that being called up to the Torah is a rabbinite ruling, the Karaites in Israel seem to have accepted this decision. Today, for example, in the two synagogues belonging to the Karaite community in Ashdod, namely Anan HaNasi and Keter Torah, there are weekly classes given by a qualified teacher to boys and girls learning to read Torah precisely. But one must note that, like in Orthodox Judaism, they do not invite the girls up to read Torah in public solely due to modesty, and not because of any sanction against teaching girls Torah and Bible. The greatest poet of the Karaite community was Moshe ben Avraham Dari, who lived in Alexandria in the middle of the 12th century. The Diwan, or collection of poems that he composed and edited, includes more than 500 poems. They are divided into secular and religious categories. The majority of his poems are written in Hebrew, but some are also in Judeo-Arabic. In the last 2 centuries, both portions of his poetic collection have been published with explanations and annotations. Researchers of these collections include Leon Weinberger, Joachim Yeshaya, Aryeh Skippers, Chagai Ben Shammai, and Uri Melammed. Dari, who edited his own diwan, added a heading to every poem and buried biographical details within that clarify the content of the poem and reveal important details about the social circumstances which are connected to the poem. One of the sections in Dari's diwan deals with poems of praise, madh in Arabic. He dedicated 5 of them to 5 Karaite boys who read the Haftorah, perhaps for the first time. 12 years ago, Chagai Ben Shammai published an article concerning one of these poems that he interpreted as the reading of Haftarah in a pseudo-bar mitzvah ceremony in the Karaite Alexandrian synagogue. Of these 5 poems, only one heading refers clearly to the reading that took place in the synagogue. It is worded as follows.
وقد قلت لما قرأ الولد داود ولد الشيخ الفخر السكندري شمارot سورو الهفترة في الكنيس only once
I'm
in the
doing the
whole
English.
diwan
Wakan yaum
في الكنيس
ma.
وكان يوم
رؤيا.
ما رؤي مثله.
I already stated that when the boy David, the son of the revered Alexandrian president, may God protect him, read the Haftarah in the synagogue, it was a day the likes of which has never been seen before. Among the secular poems that Dari composed is one testifying to the fact that a young woman was reading Torah in public with the appropriate melody and tropes of the Torah. Here Dari praises and glorifies this maiden, but does not mention her either by first name or by surname. The Judeo-Arabic heading that appears at the top of the poem, which Dari also composed, reveals a few more details about the extraordinariness of the reading executed by this Karaite young woman. There is no doubt that this lone poem constitutes a unique historical testament for acquainting us with material about the status of the Karaite Jewish woman in the early Middle Ages. It is hard to determine if this maiden's reading was done in a purely family setting in which the poet received a special invitation and thus he observed her executing her task perfectly, or if the entire event occurred in public in the synagogue in Alexandria where the community prayed. And the heading says,
ومما قلته أيضا في بنت بكر سريعة الحفظ والذكر تريد القراءة الصحيحة بنشاطة وقريحة وتحكم التنغيم واللحن من غير خطأ ولحن.
What I also said about a young virgin with the swift perception and memory, who recites the accurate reading of the Torah with diligence and talent, and she is very meticulous with the melody and the tune without any mistakes and mispronunciations. The Hebrew poem itself contains 4 verses and its meter has 8 vowels or 8 syllables. As already pointed out, the poem belongs to the category of poems of prayed
חזיתי בת תהגה תורת משה האל יגדילנה.
I have seen a damsel reciting the book of the law of Moses. May God make it great.
בלשון צח ובשפה ברא ובקול נעים ובטוב רינה.
See, I'm even in there. In plain tongue and pure language and pleasant voice and magnificent singing.
אז נמתי עת שרתי הודה ושתי אוזני תשמענה.
Therefore I announced on beholding her splendor and on hearing her with my 2 ears.
רבות בנות עשו חיל ואת עלית על כולנה.
Many daughters have done valiantly, but you surpassed them all. It appears that the great Karaite poet Moshe ben Avraham Dari endowed us with a poetic epigram that sheds light on an unknown tradition and allows us to become acquainted with the status of Jewish Karaite women in 12th century Alexandria. The description of the vitality of the Karaite maiden reading Torah in the presence of her family and other relatives, or in front of the entire Karaite congregation in the synagogue, exposed us to the talents of this young girl. If it were not enough to discover that she read a pure and perfect rendition with nary an error in the vowel structure of the words in the Torah, we learn that she also aesthetically contributed her own style and uncovered her considerable musical talents to all the listeners. She succeeded in preserving a musical tone that differentiated between the melodies of the various Torah tropes. One would assume that she was not the only female in this community to have displayed her ritual talents among the congregants, and it is most likely that she had been preceded as well as succeeded by girls or women who followed this path and took part in the prayer service and in the Torah reading. If only we had additional sources, we would then, this is what we medievalists say all the time, if only we had additional sources, we would then be able to draw a wider and more comprehensive picture of the observance of Jewish customs among the Karaites and of their special egalitarian treatment of women regarding Torah reading. We can only show our appreciation of the Karaite poet Moshe Dari, and of his incredibly sympathetic treatment of the anonymous maiden who enabled him to hear her marvelous ritual talents. Thus, it is befitting to conclude our assessment of this young woman's accomplishment by quoting Dari's own words as quoted from the verse in Proverbs 31:29, a woman of valor. Many daughters have done valiantly, but you surpassed them all. We thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the Qur'an.
Shukran jazilan. Here is the bottom. Thank you, Adele.
I see a question. Sorry.
Stand up, please.
My question is to Koren Melammed. Because of the hour, or because of my English, you said that woman, Islamic Muslim woman, doesn't read the Quran publicly, right? But in a circle of women, they do this. Yes. תחזור.
In other words, under the supervision of the halachic figures, like a qadi or a guide or supervisor, but not in the masjid. Yes, okay. No. Sometimes the family might be also there. I mean, a male group also. Sometimes, yeah. Ah. No. I meant only in public. When it comes to small groups, who cares? I mean,
just a technical question. Dari scanned his poems. I was not able to identify what meter was used in this poem. It was your punctuation?
my punctuation?
I'm asking you.
Yes.
So I'm asking what meter is he using in this
I
poem?
mentioned the 8 vowels, the 8 syllables.
Okay, but then you have Velashon.
Yeah, only Velashon, so exceptional.
Okay, fair.
He allowed himself. What's the big deal? Also, the last version.
Maybe I missed it.
So,
Magnus, did the differences in Karaite and Rabbinite practice with regard to women enter into the famous polemics between, like Sadia Gaon or any of, the polemics that were about so many issues?
As far as I know,
was this one of them?
As far as I know, the subject of women, when it comes to polemics, aside from the, all kinds of purity, halachot, only there you can find it. And also in marriage.
But did the Karaites criticize, in their polemics, did they criticize the Rabbinites?
No,
did the Rabbinites
no,
criticize them about this?
no.
That's
no,
strange, no?
The keeping 7 days According to Karaite halacha, it's only 7, with no additional. Not 14 days like Bnot Israel kiblu al atzman. Okay? So, and this was the original halakha, only 7 days. Yeah? Also the purity in the Dead Sea Scroll Society. Okay? The same, all the sections had the same halakha, 7 days according to the Torah. And then the Prushim, let's say, the rabbinic authority added another 7 days to make sure that there is no, remnant or anything about this. Yeah?
Yes, please, in the back. Thank you. I wanted to ask Sharon. Oh, sorry, is that better? Okay. I wanted to ask Sharon about the relationship between these archetypes and how they were kind of contemporaneously conceived by local regular people. I embarrassingly know nothing about the Zohar, but I wonder about the extent to which the characters or the archetypes of Leah and Rachel at all come from below and trickle up into the Zohar, whether there's any sense that they're elite archetypes that then trickle down into society, or what the connection is, if there is any at all, between those worlds.
Oh, it's my Oprah moment. So that's a great question. I don't know if I have an answer for. It's on. Hello? Yeah. Okay, great. So I don't know if I have an answer for you, because the sources that we have are elite sources. But what I've tried to do is to really try to walk the walk of the Kabbalists who were part of the circle of the Zohar. And so I have to imagine that all walks of, all types of Jews and Christians would have seen these images.
Ruth. Yeah, this is also a question for Sharon, and it's a really interesting link, and I know it's probably not something that you can. I mean, you're not going to find a letter from one of them saying, "Oh, I thought this up because I happened to be walking past the church,"
Absolutely.
So it can't ever be anything more than the internal evidence of the text. But I'm wondering whether they ever use blindness language about Leah.
Oh, okay. So yes, they do use blindness language about Leah, and they're probably at least in America, the most famous passage of the Zohar that's always taught. In fact, one of my students asked me once if this is the only passage of the Zohar that had been translated into English. Is this story about the old man and the beautiful maiden without eyes? And it's a whole story about this woman, this female figure described as being without eyes. And one of the things many scholars have looked at this and talked about how this is, how this is the Shekhinah, and how she does not have eyes because of the idea of the phallic eye, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that I'm trying to work on now is seeing a connection there between this beautiful maiden without eyes and arguing that that's Leah and not the Shekhinah.
Yes, you have a question.
So I've been wondering if, in some ways, what was going on in conceptions of Rachel was not just parallel, but even pushed conceptions of Leah. So in other words, I think obviously about the Crusades, but even within the Bible, this Rachel mourning her children. So I felt sad. I'm going to miss the Rachel talk, but could you say a little bit about that?
This will be a preview for next week. So yes, absolutely, and that separating Rachel out, or pushing Rachel out of the Sephirotic realm. How can I say this on one foot? So what we find in Kabbalah is that Rachel is not only Shekhinah, Rachel is specifically the Shekhinah in exile. She's never allowed in. And so your point is very, very true, that as you elevate Leah, there's like an inverse relationship, and Rachel gets pushed out more.
But the mourning the children, is that...
Oh, absolutely.
I just think that's the most important thing of the two in medieval. Is that just me?
No. That's exactly what happens. It's that piece that piece from Yirmiyahu that gets embraced by the Kabbalists of the Zohar, and it takes you right into Lurianic Kabbalah as well.
I have a question. Oh, better you. Moshe, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Rebecca, a question about wetness. And if I remember correctly, at least in Muslim tradition, there's this like brothers in milk, right? Yes. I don't remember. You didn't talk about it too much, right, in this talk today? Oh, sorry.
What I talked about was that milk kinship is... I just want to say fast. But what I
No,
talked
sorry.
about was milk kinship is fully articulated as blood kinship, right?
Yeah.
That Muhammad and Shira, Muslim and Shira, has just written on that.
So I wanted to ask, so it was forbidden later by Christian authorities. If it did happen against the law, which it did, is there any consequences on the children? Now they are half Muslims, or what are they? Half brothers? They have half brothers who are Muslims. What are they?
Right. So okay. So it didn't say that it was forbidden, right? In fact, what happens is that's why I really loved what Elisheva talked about in her book, because they share these similar concerns, and yet they don't forbid, right? So they say you shouldn't do this, but then they say, but actually we don't forbid it. But the other situation is that now, little by little, more anthropological approaches are starting to produce some understanding of milk kinship in Spain. There's a new study that just came out, and Deborah Blumenthal, in her new work on wet nursing and also on midwives, is finding that occasionally on the ground in a village, people will say, right, this person is not only my godmother, she also provided milk for me in the first few days of my life, or things like this in the Christian community.
I want to just make a remark that, do you know there's a new statue that was dedicated by the Pope in Philadelphia of a new equality and sistership between the church and the unblindfolded synagogue. And it's an amazing, I have a picture of it on my office door. I just have a question for Uri, if you can add. I don't know if this is answerable, but what made the Karaite, especially in their Eastern situation, treat girls more equally? What in that tradition, what in that milieu would allow for that?
I think the answer is very simple, because they based all their faith on the Bible. So there is no distinction between male and female when it comes to all kinds of commandments, except when we read Daber el Bnei Israel, or sometimes the language is referring to a person, male, and not female. But once it's not, so it's equal. So they take it for granted that many of because they didn't get the Torah Shebe'al Peh, the oral tradition, the rabbinic literature, no Mishnah, no Talmud, no Tosefta, nothing, they rejected it ideologically and faithfully. That's the whole point.
So I just want to make a grammatical point, which is, of course, it's a big topic in feminist discussion. When does man mean everyone? And when does man mean only men and not women? And that's behind the way all these laws are construed when they make that decision. And you're saying the Karaites just took it as human. Amazing. Yes, please. This is his exercise.
Yes, by the way, I can use this to say that Karaites also have milk kinship. So it's not just Islam.
Thank you.
two quick questions. You were talking about Spain and wet nursing, and you were saying, the question is like this. Wet nursing is censored by the state, right? At a certain point, you said, if I understand.
Across religious lines.
Across religious lines. So was it not censored before, if I understand correctly? I mean, what made the change? What made the Christian state censor wet nursing? And the other question was, were they monitoring, do you see an explanation, whether they were monitoring the female body or the interreligious interaction?
Right. So what happens is that among the Christians, it's mentioned quite late and quite strongly that this should not happen in Spain, right? So in ecclesiastical legislation in 1179, there's a mention at a major council among Christians saying this should not happen. But then in Spain, they're saying this should never happen, should never happen under any. And it's funny to me because there's regulation of concubinage, actually. So there's an institution called Baragania, which obviously Ruth Karras could also talk about in Spain, which is Spanish concubinage, and it is regulated in the 1100s, later 1100s in municipal statutes, and it is allowed across confessional lines. So, but there isn't a statement about the confessional background of the wet nurse. There's just a statement about how the wet nursing should be done in general. There's not a statement. So I haven't looked extensively into this, but I would not be terribly surprised if the 1000s and first half of the 1100s were a more liminal period in which a lot of this happened and people didn't comment on it so much. Sure.
Liat, I'm not sure, I think that this relates to what you're asking also. Spain, Rebecca was bringing examples of Spain. Spain is undergoing completely different development than the rest of Europe. So they have these Lateran councils that are passing all these laws, but because of the Reconquista and because of the need for Jews prior to, Afonso the Wise is the first one to start putting everything, the legal down, and he's copying what's been going on there. Fueros. Yeah. Yeah, but they're later because of what's been going on, the Muslim influence, and because of the Reconquista, and there was a big mess in Spain, and things weren't really clear.
Ask, a lot of your research has to do with documents on the ground, so the
Right.
contracts. What do you see changing in contracts? You showed us how this changes ideologically, but do you see the same change in the contracts? And thinking back about earlier sessions this morning, I'm wondering, where do people who aren't Muslims or Jews come into this? So is that allowed if they're not one of those faiths? In other words, how does this purity of blood play out on the ground?
Right. So in the contracts, and what I have are contracts in Latin and Catalan, right? And they are from Christians and Jews, and then baptized Muslim slave, previously Muslim enslaved women, but also Tatar, previously Tatar, Greek, Circassian, in other words, from the Dinaric Alps and Russia and further, come into this as time goes on. So there is a very nuanced historical set of changes. So in the Latin contracts, and sometimes also there are appearances in court registers, but in the contracts, they extend from from 1300, actually 1290s, all the way up until around 1415 is what I've collected and what I have. And among Christians, especially in the city of Barcelona, there is a marked change, right? There's this preference for the married matron. There's some unmarried women, there's some slaves, but married Christian women among Christians overwhelmingly are the majority. And then by 1400, they're overwhelmingly are not. That lightly baptized, newly baptized enslaved women are overwhelmingly, at least 3/4 of the time, serving in wet nursing work. And if they had been purchased, these women gotten pregnant, and therefore not sold out of a household, and then you'd been put to wet nursing work in the same household, they wouldn't appear. So it may even be a higher proportion of enslaved women doing that work. So that's a huge change. Among Jews, there are so I have these 25 Jewish contracts among Jews in London. There are no non-Jews in those contracts. None. And the deal with those contracts is that they take different forms, say, than the Barcelona elite, in part because these people aren't as wealthy, but in part also, I think, because of huge pressures on the Jewish community to only use Jewish wet nurses. And the other situation is that Jews are absolutely buying Muslim slaves in the 13th century, and they are absolutely putting them to domestic service. And we also know that they're treating them as concubines, and we know that they're freeing them and marrying them. Nachmanides talks about this. You can see that. But in terms of wet nursing, if there's those sexual situations, I really suspect there's wet nursing going on too. But I did also just publish an article in which I looked at the various different legislations and pressures on the Jewish community concerning slavery. And I really believe that, at least in Barcelona in the course of the 14th century, Jews are no longer at all easily able to purchase domestic slaves. So that is another pressure that means that they can't get wet nurses outside of the community. So in addition to ecclesiastics, actually some of them policing what they're claiming, going on the ground to have a posse and look for Jews, we also have these pressures that they cannot have buy Muslim slaves. And the pressures are that they start thinking of Muslim slave women as convertibles, right, as potential future Christians, and so they don't want them in the homes of Jewish owners. So at first they don't want Christian slaves or servants in there, so then they start saying, we don't even want slaves who could have been converted in there.
Craig? I'm just doing it like a tennis. This is a test.
I owe you something after this. Tennis ball. Yeah, right.
Thank you. Two questions I hope I can make brief. For Sharon, your argument reminded me of reading Ivan Marcus's work on medieval Ashkenaz, and I can't remember if it's in the book Rituals of Childhood or a chapter he has in the anthology Cultures of the Jews, but I feel that he discusses a similar process of what he calls inward acculturation, of Jews inverting motifs and even artistic forms in order to express, sort of take Christian symbols or tropes about Jews and then use them to kind of put forward a more, I don't know, confident Jewish expression of the same idea. So I don't know if you've had a feeling that what you see might fit with that idea of inward acculturation more broadly, or what other kinds of scholarship for medieval Jewish history do you feel like your stories intersect with? And then, Rebecca, I couldn't really make out if being a wet nurse is a step up for some women, because it seems like...
I didn't talk about that.
It seems like for some women it's an incredibly awful bargain to have to make, but then, could it be for a woman in a different set of circumstances a good gig, right? So I don't know if you could say more about that.
So the answer to your question is yes. Ivan Marcus was one of my dissertation advisors, and absolutely. In addition, though, many in the field of Kabbalah, there seems to have been a hesitation to try to ground the Kabbalist, if you will, on the actual ground. So there's a trend in Kabbalah scholarship towards phenomenology, and so really trying to figure out what the Kabbalists saw, what the Kabbalists ate, how the Kabbalists conducted their day is something that is new to Zohar studies.
So, Craig, thank you so much for asking that. I mean, the small thing that I did talk about was how Conversos in 1400, really in Barcelona, were not wealthy people, and that this employer, Joan de Michavila, when he employs Isabel de Conversa, is not only paying her a huge amount of money, he is allowing her to have the protection of his family, right? Because, I mean, she's going to become a member of the household for a minimum of 2 years, and this is a household with squires, and I mean, it's the household really of a Barcelona noble, right, an urban noble, and so she and her husband have made this decision. He's a tailor, right? So they may have needed an infusion, an influx of capital to their business, and so they desperately needed the money, and they're paid up front, so they're given money that they then pay a wet nurse with even before they make the final contract.
So they found their own wet nurse for their baby. But it's still a tough thing because they've decided to wean this baby at 13 months when the average peasant in the countryside is not weaning their baby unless the mother's starving before 18 months, 2 years, right? Even if they have a calcium poor diet, right? So so this is a bargain that they're hoping that this will help the family as a unit, that it will give them an influx of capital, that it'll give them connections, that it'll help Jaume, the baby, if he survives. But they are really risking his early weaning. For an enslaved woman, what happens in the Barcelona documentation is that she can be freed through wet nursing. So we have this detalla, which is this system where a master says to a slave, you're freed if you work for these many years and you do a fabulous job. So wet nurses are regularly told, you're free if you work for, and sometimes it's 8 years, sometimes it's 10 years. So it's an agreement to see a child or even children through to where they don't really need a nanny anymore. And if you do a good job and you don't steal from me, then I'll free you.
We might have time for... No?
Maybe.
Yes.
I will elaborate my short answer to Tova, if I may do so, apologizing in front of all the historians in this room. There are very few philologists or grammar people in this room. But in terms of the poetry, the quantitative poetry, Tova is right. Because if we are dealing with the meter that has only 8 syllables following 8 vowels in Hebrew, whether they are short or long, you have to keep the meter. This is like a mathematic formula. Okay? So, first of all, this meter is very unique to Jewish Andalusian that was invented in Andalusia in the Middle Ages. And Tova knows it exactly. This is not equivalent to any of the Arabic meters. This is unique to the Jewish, let's say, yard. Okay? On one hand. On the other hand, this poet, just like the other poets, they feel free sometimes to use the mobile shva, the shva na, as a full vowel, because this is half vowel grammatically speaking. Okay? So if we take the last verse that was taken from the book of Proverbs, so it says, Rabot banot asu hail. Here we have 8 syllables exactly. But the second part, ve'at alit al kulana. Ve'at. Another shva. So he is considering this shva is a full vowel, full syllable. So he has exactly 8, and he doesn't quote the verse the way he wants it, but the way it was written in the original text. That's why I said before that belashon tzah, we can't read it bilshon tzah. Doesn't go. So the mobile shva here is only a prop. That's all. Thank you.